Blaire Whitcomb stood on the far side of my fence, looked at my father's old tractor, and laughed out loud for the three board members behind her. Nobody paid $700,000 for a house so they could look at a black man's junk every morning, she said. I didn't answer. I watched her staple a violation notice to the gate of land my family had owned for almost 50 years. Blaire thought she was running me off. 3 weeks later, a line of county trucks parked in front of her subdivision, and the surveyor drove red stakes through 6 backyards before he turned to her and said, "Ma'am, the problem isn't the farm, it's under your houses. If you like stories about a board that bullied the wrong man, stay with me and watch Blaire Whitcomb lose that smile." My name is Darius Holloway. I am 48 years old, and I own 63 acres of red clay and fescue in the part of North Carolina that used to be nothing but tobacco barns and church suppers. My father, Leon Holloway, bought this place in the late 1970s with money he saved driving a gravel truck for 11 years, and he paid a white man named Fowler cash on a kitchen table because no bank in the county would sit down with him for that kind of loan. He cleared the north field himself. He set the corner posts himself. When he died the spring I turned 31, he left me a deed, a coffee can of receipts, and a metal file cabinet in the barn loft that he told me twice, in the hospital, not to throw away. I did not throw it away. That cabinet is the reason this story ends the way it does. Then in the spring of the year the eastern parcel sold. 400 and some acres of old Hargrove land went to a developer out of Charlotte, and by fall the bulldozers had scraped the guy's less down to bare orange dirt. They called it Bellweather Estates. 180 homes, a stone entrance with a fountain in it, vinyl fencing, streetlights shaped like old gas lamps, and a covenant book thicker than my father's Bible. Trucks came through in a steady line for 2 years. I didn't complain once. Growth is not a crime, and I have never believed I own the view out of anybody's window. The Homeowners Association organized the summer after the last house sold, and Blaire Whitcomb was elected president by a vote of somewhere around 40 people in a clubhouse that seats 90. I met her for the first time on a Tuesday in June while I was greasing a mower deck. She came down the gravel apron in white slacks and sunglasses that cost more than my truck's transmission, and she introduced herself with a smile so smooth it looked applied rather than felt. She told me she wanted to open a dialogue. She said the community had concerns. Then she started listing them, and the list did not stop for 11 minutes. My barn was tin, and tin was not consistent with the neighborhood aesthetic. My tractor was 31 years old and, in her words, read as abandoned. My pickup and my equipment made residents uncomfortable when they used the walking trail along the rear easement. My fence was cedar and split rail, and Bellweather had gone to considerable expense to install uniform white vinyl, and she wondered if I had considered matching it. She used the word cohesion 4 separate times. She never once asked what I grew, what I did, or what my name was after the first handshake. She called me sir, the way some people call a dog buddy. I let her finish because my father raised me to let people finish, and then I told her something very simple and very true. My farm is not in your association. It predates your subdivision by roughly 40 years. There is no covenant on this parcel, no assessment, no architectural review, and no board vote in the state of North Carolina that reaches across a property line and takes hold of land it never bought. I said it without heat. I said it the way you read a serial number off a plate. She smiled at me through all of it, and I understood then that she had already decided this conversation was a formality. She told me the association didn't need to own my land in order to protect community standards. She told me the value Bellweather brought to the grower was a benefit I was enjoying for free and a responsibility I ought to feel. Then she turned and looked at my machine yard, the hay elevator, the parts pallets under tarps, the 2 combine heads I was rebuilding for a man in Alamance County, and she said it loud enough for the 3 board members standing behind her at the gate to hear every syllable. No one paid $700,000 for a house to look at a black man's junk. One of the board members looked at the ground, the other 2 did not. I stood there with a grease gun in my hand, and I felt my pulse in my ears. I have been called worse in this county, and I have learned that the man who loses his temper first is the man who gets written up as the problem. So I asked her one question. I asked her what she had just called my property. And Blaire Whitcomb, president of Bellweather Estates, lifted her chin about a 1/4 inch and said, "You heard me." Then she waited. She wanted a raised voice, a slammed gate, something she could describe in an email that evening. I gave her nothing. I walked to the gate, closed it, dropped the chain, and went back to my mower deck. The next morning there was a manila envelope hanging on my fence, punched through the top wire with a zip tie, damp at the bottom corner from dew. I stood there looking at it for a full minute before I touched it. Inside was a document titled Notice of Continuing Violations, Bellweather Estates Homeowners Association, and a schedule of fines totaling $2,400. There were 11 line items: unscreened agricultural equipment, non-conforming outbuilding, nuisance dust generation, unpermitted commercial activity, fencing materials inconsistent with community standards. Each one carried a daily accrual rate, and at the bottom, in bold, a warning that continued non-compliance would result in referral to council and the recording of a lien. She did not send the fines to a collections firm because her own attorney almost certainly told her what I already knew. Instead, she changed the shape of the fight. Over the next 9 weeks, the county received a steady stream of correspondence about Holloway Ridge Farm, and I know it was steady because eventually I requested the file and read every page. Complaints about tractor noise before 7 in the morning, complaints about dust from the field road, complaints about diesel odor, complaints about a drainage ditch redirecting stormwater onto Bellweather lots, complaints about the tin barn being structurally unsafe, complaints about heavy trucks using a residential corridor. 11 letters in all, 6 of them signed by Blaire, 5 of them signed by residents who I later learned had been handed a template at a board meeting. The inspectors came, a zoning officer, then a stormwater technician, then a man from environmental health who spent 2 hours walking my ditch line with a clipboard. I cooperated with every one of them completely. I opened gates, I pulled records, I showed them my ag exemption paperwork, my sales receipts, my equipment titles, my burn permits going back 6 years. My father taught me that the fastest way to end an inspection is to hand the man everything before he asks, and he was right every single time. One of them, a young guy named Purnell, actually thanked me and said he wished half the farms in the county kept files like mine. The findings came back over about a month, and they were not close. My operation was a bona fide agricultural use protected under state right-to-farm provisions established decades before the subdivision was platted. My barn had been built under a permit issued in 1982 and was not a hazard. My hours of operation were exempt from the residential noise ordinance. The drainage ditch was not only legal, it was carrying water the way an old recorded plan said it was supposed to, and the technician noted in his report that the newer development upstream had increased flow into it by a substantial margin. Not one citation was issued against me, nothing, zero. That should have ended it. Instead, it changed something in Blaire, and I watched it happen from 12 feet away on a Saturday in September when she came down my gravel with a folder under her arm. She was not smiling that day. She told me I needed to understand that this area had changed, that the corridor was moving in a direction, and that people had invested their lives in the standard Bellweather represented. I told her she was probably right about the direction. Then I said, "But my deed hasn't changed." She looked at me for a second too long, and then she said the thing I have not forgotten and never will. People like you usually sell when an area develops. I know exactly what people like you means. I have known since I was 9 years old, and a man at a hardware counter in Graham asked my father whose truck he was driving. I could have said any one of 100 things to her. What I said was quiet, and I meant every word of it. Then you should hope I'm like the ones you've met before. Her jaw moved. She wanted anger she could photograph, and she got a sentence she had to think about instead, and she did not enjoy the difference. She turned around and walked back up my gravel drive in shoes that were never built for it. 2 days later, a certified letter came from the association's law firm in Greensboro. It was 3 pages, and the substance of it was on page 2. Bellweather Estates demanded that I immediately cease all use of the unimproved dirt lane running along the rear boundary of the subdivision, characterizing my use of it as a trespass across common area owned by the association, and reserving all rights and remedies. I read it twice standing at the mailbox. Then I laughed, out loud, alone on the side of a county road. Because of all the ground on this earth Blaire Whitcomb could have picked to make her stand, she had picked the one strip I knew the most about. That lane is older than the pavement it connects to. It runs from my north field down along a low swale, crosses the drainage cut, and comes out on Kelvin Church Road about a quarter-mile below the Bellweather entrance. Before the developer scraped the rise, it ran through open Hargrove hayfield, and my father used it every week of his working life, because getting a baler from the barn to the north field any other way means going up the county road with a wide load and a flashing light and a prayer. After Bellweather was built, the rear property line of 6 lots came down to within a stone's throw of that lane, and their walking trail was cut parallel to it. I used the lane maybe 5 or 6 times a month in daylight at idle speed. I have never once damaged a thing out there. The following week, Blaire escalated in the most Blaire way possible. She had the landscaping contractor set 2 concrete planters, square ones with boxwoods in them, directly across the mouth of the lane where it met the county road, and she had a wooden sign screwed to a post beside them. Private community property, no agricultural access, violators will be prosecuted. She sent an email to residents announcing the improvement. I found out about it at 6:40 in the morning when I came around the bend with a tractor and a rake behind me and had to shut down. Here is where a younger version of me makes a mistake. A younger version of me hooks a chain to those planters and drags them into the ditch, and by 9 o'clock there are photographs of a black man destroying community property, and the story becomes something else entirely. I sat on that tractor for a while with the engine idling, and I thought about my father, who never in his life gave a man the version of himself that man was fishing for. Then I backed up, went home the long way, and got my phone. I photographed the planters, the sign, the post, the sight lines, the county road, and the mouth of the lane from 4 angles with the date on. Then I climbed up into the barn loft and pulled open my father's file cabinet. I spread my father's 1978 survey out on the workbench under a shop light and traced the lines with my finger. There it was, drawn as a dashed corridor with a bearing and a distance and a note lettered in the same careful hand as everything else on that sheet. 60-foot agricultural access and drainage easement for the benefit of the Holloway parcel across the Hargrove tract. 60 feet, not a path, not a courtesy, not a habit the neighbors had tolerated. A recorded 60-foot wide legal corridor granted in writing, notarized, and filed in the county register nearly 2 decades before a single Bellweather foundation was poured. Then I looked at where the corridor went, and I sat down on the stool. The dashed line did not run along the eventual rear boundary of the subdivision the way the dirt lane does today. It cut northeast at an angle across ground that, on the modern map in my kitchen drawer, is now the back half of 6 lots on Cardinal Reach and Wyeth Lane. I pulled the county's online parcel map up on my laptop, overlaid it by hand, and checked the bearing against 2 iron pins 3 times because I did not trust myself. The line went under things. It went through fences and past retaining walls, and it clipped at least 1 garage corner, and I sat in that barn loft for a long time with a shop light humming over my head. Then she asked, "Darius, do you know what they've built on this alignment?" I said, "Houses." She held my eyes for a second and said, "No, I'm asking you how many." The answer, once we did it properly, was 6. Marin hired her own surveyor to run a preliminary tie from the 2 original iron pins, and she ordered a full title search and on all 6 of the affected Bellweather lots, and she gave me one instruction before we started: do not speak to Blaire Whitcomb again. Not a word, not a wave, not a letter, nothing but silence and photographs. If the association wanted to escalate, they were welcome to escalate into a wall they could not see. I asked her whether we should tell the county what we had found. She said the county would find it themselves, and that it would matter a great deal more when they did. Then Marin opened the final construction drawings for Phase 3, and the corridor had moved, not vacated, not released, not relocated by any instrument either of us could find, simply drawn in a different place, redirected down along what became the rear boundary line, which is the alignment of the dirt lane I had actually been driving for years without ever thinking twice about it. There was no consent from Leon Holloway in the record. There was no consent from me. There was no recorded relocation agreement, no quitclaim, no abandonment petition, no court order, nothing. Somebody had picked up a pencil and solved a problem on paper that had never been solved in the world. Marin explained the consequence in language I could repeat, and I have repeated it 100 times since. A recorded easement does not go away because a later drawing ignores it. It does not expire from disuse in this state, and it certainly does not expire because the party benefiting from it was politely using a slightly different route in the meantime. 60 feet of legal corridor still sat exactly where the 1978 survey put it, and everything within that corridor that was built after the easement was recorded without my family's written consent was an encroachment. She was careful with me about scale, and I appreciated that because I had spent 2 nights imagining bulldozers and feeling sick about it. No entire house sat inside the book, not one. What sat inside it, based on the preliminary tie, was a collection of pieces. A detached garage slab at the number 120 lot, clipped at the corner. A stamped concrete patio and pergola footing behind 124. A segmented block retaining wall running the length of 2 backyards, a section of vinyl fence across 4 of them. And most seriously, a stormwater outfall and a buried pipe run that had been built to discharge into the old drainage cut at a point the developer had no recorded right to use. And then she pointed out the piece that still makes me shake my head. None of this was going to surface on its own. That easement had been quietly ignored for years by everybody, including me, because I had a perfectly good lane to drive and no reason to pull my father's cabinet apart. Title insurance had been issued on those 6 lots. Closings had happened. Families had moved in, planted trees, poured patios, and gone on with their lives. The paper sat in a drawer in a county office and in a barn loft and did absolutely nothing to anybody. Then the president of the association demanded, in writing on law firm letterhead, that the county and I recognize her board's exclusive control of that exact strip of ground. Marin said it plainly. If she had left the road alone, nobody would have looked. That was the first time in 4 months that I smiled about any of it. I sat back in that chair in Durham and I said, then let her keep going. Marin told me that was not a strategy, and I said I understood, and she said good, because here is the actual strategy. We do not sue anybody. We do not send a threatening letter. We respond to the association's demand by filing a request for an easement determination with county planning, attaching the recorded instrument, the original survey, and the developer's own preliminary plat, and we let the government read its own files. She filed it on a Thursday, then she told me to stay off the lane entirely until it was resolved, which was inconvenient and cost me most of a hay cuttings, but she wanted the record clean. So for 5.5 weeks I hauled equipment out the long way, up Kelvin Church and around, wide load, flashers on 22 minutes each direction instead of 4. I did it without complaint, and in that silence Blaire Whitcomb concluded that she had won. I know she concluded it because a resident forwarded me the email. It went out to all 180 households under the subject line Community Standards Update, and in it the president reported that the board's sustained enforcement effort had successfully resolved the ongoing farm access issue at the eastern boundary, that agricultural traffic had ceased, and that the association's investment in legal counsel had protected property values for every homeowner in Bellweather. There was a line thanking the board for its resolve in a difficult matter. There was a line about the importance of holding the line on standards. She had put it in writing. She had put all of it in writing, and she had sent it to 180 households, and copies of that email would later sit in a county file next to my father's survey. 10 days after that, she came down my drive again, and this time she brought 2 board members with her and a leather portfolio. She was pleasant, that was the test. She said she hoped we could move past an unpleasant chapter, and then she made me an offer. There was an investment group with ties to several Bellweather residents, she said, prepared to purchase approximately 14 acres of my eastern frontage, the piece that runs along their rear boundary, at a price she described as generous and immediate. She slid a single sheet across the top of my gate post. The number on it was somewhere under half of what that frontage was worth, and I knew what it was worth, because 2 developers had already approached me privately in the previous year, and I had said no to both. I read it, folded it, and handed it back. She did not take it. She said this was the best opportunity I was going to see, that the market had a window that a man my age ought to think about simplifying. Then she let her eyes travel over my barn, my parts, my truck, the hay elevator, the tractor sitting under its shed with a tarp over the seat, and she said, "Do you really want to keep all of this?" I have thought about that question a great deal since. She was not asking about equipment. She was asking whether I understood that she considered my entire life out here to be clutter that she was offering to clear away for me. So I answered the question she actually asked. Land doesn't become worthless because you don't like who owns it. One of the board members, a man named Frank Aldous, looked at his shoes and did not look up again for the rest of it. Blaire straightened and told me that the association would be pursuing every legal remedy available to it, and that I should not mistake her patience for weakness. I said, "You should do that." I said it without any edge at all, and I meant it more sincerely than any sentence I had spoken to her yet. She could not read me. It bothered her visibly. She had a script for an angry man and a script for a frightened man and no script at all for a calm one. The next morning at 7:10, I opened my email and there it was, copied to Marin, copied to the association's registered agent, copied to the developer's successor entity from the office of Gavin Price, Director of County Planning. Subject line, site inspection scheduled, Bellweather Estates Holloway recorded easement conflict. I read it 3 times, then I poured a second cup of coffee, walked out to the fence with it, and stood there in the wet grass looking across at those roof lines for a long while, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt the way you feel when a long argument is finally going to be settled by somebody who has no reason to care which of you wins. They came on a Tuesday 8:40 in the morning, 3 white county trucks and a 4th from a private survey firm under contract. The man in charge was Ethan Crowley, 43, county land surveyor, wearing a safety vest over a button-down and carrying the flattest expression I have ever seen on a working man. He came to my gate first, introduced himself, confirmed my identity, and asked permission to work from my monuments. I walked him to the northeast pin myself and pulled the grass back off it with my boot. He knelt down, read the cap, looked at his tablet, and said, "Renshaw and Sons," and something in his face changed by about 2%. That was as excited as Ethan Crowley got all day. She was thrilled. That is the part I want understood. She thought the cavalry had arrived. She told Ethan she was the association president. She said she was glad someone was finally addressing this. She said she had been documenting the situation for over a year and had a complete file she would be happy to provide. Ethan looked up from his tablet and asked, addressing what? Blaire pointed across the fence at my barn and said, property violations, the farm, the equipment, the noise, the encroachment on our corridor. And Ethan Crowley said, we're not here about the farm. I watched her face. There is a specific way a smile comes apart, not all at once but in stages, the mouth staying up after the eyes have already quit. She asked him to repeat himself. He did in the same tone he would have used to read a rainfall total. We're here to locate a recorded easement. She said the association owns all common area within the subdivision and all of the land along that boundary, and she said it with real confidence because as far as her deed went, it was true. Ethan said ownership of land and an easement over land are not the same thing, ma'am. Then he asked his rodman for a stake. The first one went into the mowed lawn behind number 118 11 feet inside the fence, and the man swung a hammer twice and drove that red flag stake down into somebody's fescue. The second went in beside the detached garage at 120, close enough that the rodman had to lean over the corner of the slab to hold the rod plumb. The third went through the vinyl fence line at 124, and to set it they had to unclip a panel. Then one at the corner of a patio, then one at the base of a segmented retaining wall behind 130. Then one down in the swale right at the mouth of a 12-inch outfall pipe I had never looked at closely in my life. 6 lots, red flags in a straight line running through 6 backyards like a stitch. Blaire followed him the whole way and her voice climbed with each stake. What are you doing? You cannot mark private property. There are children in that yard. Do you have authorization? Ethan stopped, opened a rolled drawing on the tailgate of his truck and weighted the corners with a level and his water bottle. He put one finger on the dash corridor and one finger on the developer's preliminary plat beside it and said, this instrument was recorded in 1978 and appears on your own subdivision submitted plat. He said, our office has no record of it ever being released or lawfully relocated. He said portions of 6 lots appear to lie within the corridor. Then he rolled the drawing back up. She turned around and looked at me. I need to describe this carefully because it is the moment the whole thing hinged on. For a year she had looked at me one way, the way you look at something in the road you would rather not have to steer around, and standing in that swale in her good shoes with a red stake 11 feet inside her neighbor's fence, she looked at me a completely different way. Not as a lesser man, as a problem she did not understand the shape of, holding something she had no idea she needed. I did not smile. I did not say a word. I did not walk over. I stood at my own fence with a coffee cup in my hand on my own dirt, and I let her look. Frank Aldous came down the trail and asked me across the wire quietly what all this was. I told him he should ask his president because I had been trying to have that conversation for a year and she had never once wanted to have it with me. Then I went back to the barn because I had a rake to finish and a customer expecting it Thursday, and the county did not need my help to read its own maps. The counterattack came inside 48 hours, and it was uglier than anything that had happened yet. Blaire sent 2 emails and held 1 emergency board session, and by the weekend the story circulating in Bellweather Estates was that Darius Holloway had spent a year quietly preparing to seize part of the subdivision, that I intended to force demolition of homes, that I was seeking a payout in the millions from association reserves, that the farm complaints had been the board's attempt to protect residents from a man who had been planning this all along. She used the phrase opportunistic claim. She used the phrase manufactured crisis. One line said the association would not be held hostage by a decades-old piece of paper. For about 10 days it worked. I got looks at the feed store. Somebody drove past my gate at night and laid on the horn. A woman I had sold hay to twice unloaded her bales back onto my apron and asked for her money, and she was crying while she did it, and she told me she had 2 little girls and her whole down payment in that house. That one sat on me hard. I want to be honest about the shape of my anger here, because it did not point where Blaire wanted it to point. I was not angry at that woman. She had bought a house from a builder, paid for title insurance, signed 40 documents she trusted a closing attorney to have read, and none of what was in that corridor was her doing. That is what I told Maren the next time we met, and I told it to her before she could talk to me about leverage. I said, I don't want 6 families to lose their homes. I want the association to stop pretending I'm a trespasser on my own father's easement. Maren put down her pen and asked me whether I understood how much leverage I was declining. I said I understood exactly, and that a man who takes 6 houses to win an argument with one woman has not actually won anything he can live next to. She sat back and said, all right. Then we can build something they will have a very hard time refusing. So we drafted a relocation agreement, and I want to lay out the terms because everything after this depends on how reasonable they were. I would consent to formally relocate my 60-foot corridor off the 6 lots and onto the alignment along the rear boundary, the one I had actually been using, and I would sign a release freeing those 6 titles once it was done. In exchange, the association would fund all survey, engineering, and legal costs on both sides. It would build the new access to a written standard, base and stone, wide enough and graded for equipment with a proper crossing over the drainage cut. It would correct the stormwater discharge so it was lawful and no longer dumping into ground it had no right to. It would remove the planters, the sign, and anything else obstructing my access, and it would withdraw every violation notice against me in writing and issue a letter confirming Holloway Ridge Farm lay entirely outside its jurisdiction. Not $1 of damages, not one house touched. Marin walked it across to the association's attorney on a Monday. He read it, and by her account he was quiet for a while, and then he said he would recommend it to his client. Blaire refused. She refused it in a board meeting out loud, and she refused it because signing that agreement meant conceding on paper that Bellweather had been in the wrong from the first envelope on my fence, and that the man she had described in front of witnesses as a pile of junk was the party whose signature they needed. She told the room that the association would not be extorted by a person like me. Meanwhile, the county's file kept growing because Gavin Price had opened a formal review, and formal reviews pull threads. Somewhere in the developer's transferred records was a name, and that name led to a retired engineer named Wade Hollister, 62, living out past Snow Camp with a pond and a workshop. He had been a project engineer on Bellweather through Phase 2 and part of Phase 3, and when the county called him, he did not hedge for a second. He said he had wondered for years when somebody would ask. Then he went into his garage and came back with a banker's box and a laptop full of exported email. What Wade had was the paper trail of a problem that got managed instead of solved. In the spring of the second year of construction, his team flagged the Holloway easement during design review and put it in writing. There was a memo. There was a markup with the corridor highlighted in yellow across what would become lots on Cardinal Reach. There was a note from the development manager saying they would open discussions with the Holloway family regarding a relocation or a purchase of the corridor rights. And there was one line in a construction sequencing document that Gavin Price would eventually read out loud in a room full of homeowners. Resolve Holloway easement prior to Phase 3 construction. They never resolved it. Wade said somebody did drive out to talk to my father, and I believe him because I have a vague memory of Leon Holloway telling me a man in a nice truck came around about the road and that he had told him he was not interested in giving up his access. My father said no. There is nothing in the record that says he ever said anything else. And then the schedule moved, the lender pushed, the manager left the company 9 months later, and Phase 3 got built right through it, and everybody involved went on to other jobs in other counties and eventually to retirement ponds out past Snow Camp. The county's review turned up one last document, and this one belonged to Blaire. 14 months before she stapled that envelope to my fence, a board member named Denise Rourke had emailed the full board asking whether an old farm easement might still burden the eastern boundary and urging a title review before any enforcement out there. Blaire's reply was 2 sentences long. Council saw no merit in the concern, and she would not spend community funds chasing a rumor, so she did not create the encroachment. She was told there might be one, in writing, by a member of her own board, and she chose not to look, because looking might have complicated a campaign she had already decided to run against the man on the other side of the fence. Then she sent the letters. Then she set the planters. Then she demanded the county come out and settle the question of who controlled that strip of ground. Every single stake Ethan Crowley drove that Tuesday morning went into the earth because Blaire Whitcomb would rather have been rid of me than be careful. The association's annual meeting fell on the second Thursday in November, and the clubhouse was standing room only. I did not have to be there. Marin said the county was going to present regardless and that my presence was optional. I went anyway, and I wore a clean shirt and sat in the back row with my hat in my lap because a man who is being talked about ought to be in the room where it happens. Ethan Crowley set up a projector. Gavin Price sat down front with a folder. Blaire opened the meeting on time and tried for about 11 minutes to keep hold of the story. She told the room that an outside party was attempting to leverage an antique document against the community. She said the board had acted at every step to protect homeowners. She said that in her view the correct response was litigation and that she would be asking for a special assessment to fund it. Somebody in the third row asked how much of an assessment. She said council was preparing a range. Somebody else asked what the range was. She said she would not negotiate a number from the floor. And that is when Gavin Price stood up and asked politely if the county might clarify the record before the association voted on anything. He was not there to take a side, and he said so twice. Then he laid it out in about 6 minutes in language a room of accountants and nurses and contractors could follow. There is a validly recorded easement 60 feet wide appurtenant to the Holloway parcel dating to 1978. It appears on the subdivision's own approved preliminary plat. The county has located no instrument releasing, terminating, or lawfully relocating it. Field survey indicates that portions of 6 lots, along with a stormwater outfall serving a much larger drainage area, lie within the corridor. The county will require a remediation plan, and then he said the sentence Blaire had spent 3 weeks trying to keep out of that room. In practical terms, this is a paperwork failure from the construction era, not a dispute with a neighbor. Blaire asked him whether the county intended to make residents tear down their homes. Gavin said nobody has said that, nobody has suggested it, and the county's preference in every case like this is a negotiated relocation. Then he looked toward the back of the room and he said, in fact, Mr. Holloway submitted a proposed relocation agreement 6 weeks ago that resolves the encroachment without touching a single structure. And I watched about 90 heads turn from Gavin Price to Blaire Whitcomb, and I watched her understand, roughly 2 seconds before everybody else did, exactly what was about to be asked. A man standing along the side wall, whose name I learned later was Curtis Hale and whose patio was the one with the pergola footing in it, asked the only question that mattered. Then why didn't the board agree to it? Blaire said the proposal contained unacceptable conditions. Curtis asked what they were. She said she was not going to litigate terms in an open meeting. Marin stood up from the second row, said good evening, identified herself as my attorney, and said she would be glad to read the terms in full since her client had no objection whatsoever to any homeowner in that room knowing them. She read all 5: survey and legal costs paid by the association, a new access road built to a stated specification, the drainage corrected and lawfully permitted, obstructions removed, the violation notices withdrawn, and a letter confirming the farm sits outside association jurisdiction. Then she stopped, folded the page, and said, that is the complete list. There is no request for money damages. There is no request that any structure be altered or removed. My client has not asked this association for $1, and he has offered to sign a release on 6 titles the day the new road is finished. And the room sat there in that particular silence people fall into when they realize the villain in the story they were told is sitting in the front of the room holding the gavel. Then Ethan Crowley turned on the projector. He put up the 1978 survey first, then the developer's preliminary plat, then a current aerial with the corridor overlaid in red, and the red band ran across 6 backyards in a clean diagonal, straight through a garage corner and a patio and a retaining wall and out into the swale. He did not editorialize. He said, this line is the easement. These are the improvements within it. He clicked once more and put up the construction sequencing note. Resolve Holloway easement prior to Phase 3 construction. Nobody breathed. I looked at Blaire, and she was not looking at me with contempt. She was looking at the screen the way you look at your own signature on something you do not remember signing. That was when the meeting stopped being about property lines. Curtis Hale asked how a fight with a farmer had become a legal matter in the first place, and Marin said she could answer that factually, and she handed the secretary copies of the association's first violation notice, its demand letter, and the president's community update declaring victory over the farm access issue. People read them. And then a woman near the front said she wanted to raise something she had been sitting on since June of the prior year, and she described standing at my gate as part of a board walkthrough and hearing the president call my property a black man's junk. Blaire denied it immediately and flatly. She said that was a mischaracterization, that she had never used such language, and that she found the accusation offensive. And Frank Aldis, who had not said a word all evening, said quietly from the end of the second row that he had been standing about 4 feet away and that she had said it exactly that way, and that he thought about it every week since and had said nothing, and that he was ashamed of that. Nobody yelled. Nobody stood up. There was no scene at all. Just 100 people in a clubhouse doing the arithmetic on whose money had paid for which letters and why. Blaire looked at me then, finally directly, in front of all of them, and I stood up because I had exactly 2 things to say, and I had been carrying them for a year and a half. I said, I never once asked Bellweather Estates to like my farm. You can think my barn is ugly. You can think my tractor is a disgrace. That is your right, and it costs me nothing. Then I said the second thing, but you don't get to turn contempt into ownership. My father's line was on a map before your fountain was a drawing, and no amount of looking down on me was ever going to move it. Then I sat back down and put my hat back in my lap. The rest happened the way these things happen when the paper is clear and the pressure is real. The board voted 8 days later to suspend Blaire's authority as president pending review, and she resigned in the middle of the following meeting rather than sit through it. The association's own attorney told them in writing that litigating against a recorded appurtenant easement with the county's determination already in the file would cost them a great deal of money and lose. So they came back to the table and took the agreement essentially as we had written it, with 2 additions their engineer wanted and 1 addition Marin insisted on. The final terms went into a recorded instrument in February. The association paid my survey and legal costs in full, which came to just under $19,000. It built a new 60-foot access corridor along the rear boundary, base rock and crushed stone, crowned and ditched, with a reinforced crossing over the drainage cut rated for equipment. It re-engineered and permitted the stormwater discharge so the water leaving Bellweather does so lawfully. It removed the planters, the post, and the sign at the county road. It recorded the relocated easement with a proper legal description tied to real monuments. The old corridor was released from all 6 lots the day the new road passed final inspection, and every one of those 6 titles is clean today. Every violation notice against me was withdrawn in writing, and I have the letter stating that Holloway Ridge Farm lies entirely outside the association's jurisdiction, framed in the barn, next to my father's survey. The new road opened the last week of May. It is 30 feet wider than what I had, it drains, and it does not turn to soup in a wet spring, and I can put a baler and a rake down it without holding my breath. The first morning it was open, I took the tractor out. That tractor is a 1994 model with 14,000 hours on it and a seat my father wore down to the foam. It is the exact thing Blaire Whitcomb stood at my fence and called junk in front of witnesses. I drove it the full length of the corridor, past the back of every one of those 6 houses, at an idle, in no hurry at all. A woman on a deck at 124 raised her coffee cup at me. Nobody stopped me. Nobody was ever going to stop me again. A few weeks after that, I came up the corridor toward the county road late in the afternoon, and Blaire was standing near the stone entrance with a leash in her hand and no dog on the other end of it that I could see. She had sold, I heard, but the sign had not gone up yet. She watched the tractor come. I brought it down to a stop and let it idle, because I was not going to pretend I had not seen her. She looked at the machine for a second, and then she said, barely loud enough over the engine, "You won." And I said, "No, Blaire, I just kept what was already mine." Then I put it back in gear and drove home. I sat in the yard that evening until the light went orange over the tin. The barn was still standing, the truck was still there, the hay pallets, the 2 combine heads. The whole inventory of a working life that a woman with a clubhouse and a gavel had held up as proof that I did not belong in my own county. All of it exactly where it was the morning she stapled that envelope to my fence. Bellweather Estates has stone columns and a lit fountain and houses that appraise near $1 million. But I have 63 acres, a name on the plat older than the pavement, and the paperwork Blaire Whitcomb was too proud to read. There are people who look at your clothes, your skin, the truck you drive, the roof over your head, and believe they have finished the job of learning what you are worth. Blaire looked across my fence and saw a mess she wanted cleared away. What was actually out there was a metal file cabinet in a hayloft with a notarized page in the bottom drawer, and when the county finally unrolled that page, every single thing she had held in contempt became the thing she needed my signature on to save the subdivision she bragged about. Blaire thought her fence decided who belonged out here. It turned out one old line of ink on my father's deed decided all of it.